My name is James Fitzgerald, and today we'll be talking to you about my review and analysis of pica interventions. My review and analysis, my review of pica and its negative effects, as well as an investigation that explores the different interventions that were applied. My review summarizes published studies that examine the assessment and practice of behavioral interventions in the management of pica in people with learning disabilities. And it also explores differential reinforcement, punishment interventions related to pica, and discrimination training lightly. We will also look at the acceptability of these interventions and the recommendations of some future areas of research that might prove beneficial. So just a background, some people may ask, what is pica exactly? Well, pica is defined as the ingestion of inedible non-food items. And although this type of problem behavior can be seen in the normal population, it's most often observed in individuals with mental illnesses. The behavioral problem has potentially life-threatening health hazards, which include toxicity, infection, choking, gastrointestinal blockages, and obstructions. It's basically just not a very healthy practice, ingesting items that are not able to be digested by the human body. So first we will explore some studies that looked into differential reinforcement. So that first, Hagopian, Gonzalez, Rivet, Triggs, and Clark in 2011, they completed an investigation into differential reinforcement paired with blocking techniques. Their study included 2 teen participants, I believe they were 13 and 19. Both were admitted to a treatment center for pica and other problem behaviors. Their treatment included 2 types of modifications in the behavior chain associated with participants. The first part of the intervention bypassed the first behavior in the chain, which was identified via an FA as picking up the potential pica item. So what they did is they focused on the second part of the behavior chain, which was putting the pica item into their mouth. And they altered this by using response blocking and differential reinforcement. The research that they did was supported by a previous study that investigated response blocking, although they looked at the first step in the chain by McCord, Grosser, Iwata, and Powers in 2005. The participants here were taught to discard or put away the items instead of ingesting them. The intervention was organized so that picking up the items signaled the obtainability of their reinforcement for discarding the items. And that study kept the first link of the chain, and response blocking was applied later in the chain to establish a substitute action as the later step. This was a little bit different from the previous investigations because it evaluated the effectiveness of the treatment in natural environment settings, which is something that I've noticed throughout my review of different studies is something that lacks a little bit. A lot of the studies are in clinical settings for the most part. After they demonstrated the efficacy of the intervention in the clinical setting, the treatment was evaluated in the naturalistic settings, which were more community settings. So here, DRA was used, differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, such as putting hands in their pockets, throwing trash items away, or just basically putting items where they needed to be. So if it was something that was on the floor, could it be picked up and put on a shelf, on a table, just real basic knowledge. There was a significant reduction of pica in this study. However, there were multiple limitations in these particular studies. The first limitation was that during the baseline phases, there was no trash receptacle for participants to place any of the trash-typed objects. So although baseline did show, obviously they were picking up these items and placing them in their mouth or ingesting them, there was not really any alternative thing that they could do with them at that time. A second limitation was that there was no control for practitioner proximity during the Hagopian one, which was the first article that we explored. There was a therapist present and in close proximity during each phase, including baseline. So due to this, there's not really a way of collecting the data on whether the intervention was effective without the presence of a therapist. So would this generalize to the natural settings when maybe someone, a caretaker or therapist, practitioner, anything is not in their direct area? The next intervention strategy we'll explore is punishment procedures. Just a note, these were very mild punishment procedures. There was nothing extremely aversive done in these, but we will continue. So per Fieri, Tam, and Weir in 2006, they actually used food as an aversion procedure. The reason that they used it in this case was because the same individual that was engaging in pica behaviors was also engaging in food refusal. So during baseline, the participant was observed in a classroom setting during normal activities. However, they were at a desk. and data was collected on their pica instances. So any items that could be considered non-food and pica likely were coated with tapioca pudding, which in this case was aversive, obviously due to the participant's food refusal. Aggression did increase and spike when the participant engaged in pica and encountered the food. However, they went through, I believe it was 5 different phases, beginning with baseline. They then moved from baseline to coating individual items in close proximity to the person in tapioca pudding, and then generalized it to a full classroom setting where they coated every available object in tapioca pudding, which sounds a little wild. However, it did work because they were able to fade it out during 4 different phases, and it was generalized much more throughout the classroom environment, at least. They moved from the desk to the full environment. And the data from this study showed that after just phase one, so the initial tapioca coating, pica dramatically reduced to almost zero actually after the first phase. And at the end of phase two, faded all the way down to zero. The final phase was actually considered a follow-up collection of data, and there was zero manifestations of the behavior, which is awesome. So, what does this mean exactly? The findings suggest that the food aversion may be useful in the reduction of pica as a mild form of punishment. The participants' pica was reduced from hazardous levels of what they collected in baseline, which was 51 times per session, to 0 times per session using a non-preferred food item. After 1 year, these results were maintained at near zero levels. Obviously, this was a very individualized technique, which happened to work very much hand in hand with the food refusal behaviors as well. Some limitations behind this study. It wasn't fully controlled, so treatment wasn't withdrawn, and multiple baselines weren't implemented. They're obviously focused on the one child diagnosed with autism in a school setting, so they may not generalize to different populations, ages, environments, etc. And they actually never conducted a functional analysis due to their time constraints, as they said it. They presumed it was to be under the function of automatic reinforcement based on the occurrence of it with and without a therapist present, from what they believe. But honestly, an FA would have given it much greater depth to the study, much greater reasoning for what they were doing, etc. So although it proved successful in this case, it would need to be individualized a lot for most participants in a similar training. One notable thing for this, which I like to put down as was it useful or not, the quality of life of the participant was noted as noticeably increased because it was less pica, which generalized to the home environment, which was seen in the follow-up phase. They also did investigate this a little bit. The generalization of this study was lacking a little bit since they never actually implemented any of the steps in another environment other than controlled classroom. But it was good to see that they did generalize in the home. I think they should have added a treatment phase to generalize to that setting in general. But major advantage to this was the practitioners of the study. It was a very easy to implement study, and the reliability within the study was very high and simple enough that different staff members or possibly someone trying to replicate this study would be able to implement it with little to no difficulty. The next thing we will be looking at quickly will be a combination of interventions. So this was actually an analysis over multiple articles that were listed into one, and they discussed differential reinforcement of pica, exposing participants to mild forms of punishment, and discrimination training. So this review explored how appropriate these interventions were, especially the punishment procedures, since those are technically a little bit controversial at times. Within these studies, they found a variety of different interventions that were in fact successful. Were in fact successful. However, the results were entirely dependent on the participant themselves. Punishment procedures were the highlight of the review, and although they were stated as being proven and highly effective in those with learning abilities who suffer from pica, it elaborates that punishment is not their preferred form of intervention based on the intrusiveness to the client. So now what I would like to briefly discuss would be some limitations that have been observed in multiple studies here. So all the aforementioned research that I slightly dabbled into employed behavioral interventions with those with intellectual disabilities, which we'll just say ID for now to make it short. So although it's common to see pica within the ID community, it's got to be noted that pica also occurs in a lot of other situations. There are some cultures that this is actually common in. It does happen in typically developing humans. Particularly, something I did find a little interesting was actually seen in pregnant women, and there's also some other variables that can play into it. The significance behind this is that not all interventions have been investigated. They won't apply to everyone. The individual that's affected by pica may have a different intellectual ability, culture, personal preferences for interventions, etc. Any research read about should really be taken lightly, and a functional analysis, if allowed by the severity of the behavior, should be conducted before the intervention is created for the individual. That way we can identify the function and target the specific aspect of behavior that needs to be. Another noteworthy limitation was the age range that was used. So the maximum age in any of the studies that I found that were relevant was the age of 19. Therefore, a lot of the findings concerned adolescents and teens only. This could have an effect on the outcome of an intervention if you tried to employ some of the strategies used in these articles to someone in an older population. And there's a variety of factors within this, which is a pretty big fault. So the factor of the younger participants, all studies except the response blocking intervention were held in the clinical only settings. So due to this, generalization is also something that should really be looked at as almost not being possible at all in these cases. Future research is definitely needed to explore the efficacy of managing pica via behavioral interventions. Populations without learning disabilities should really be investigated, in my opinion. This review found studies pretty much only contained in the IDE category. Spread of research across those who are not subject to these conditions may actually help us learn more and get some more insight on information that aids in the development of a more standardized method that could possibly be applicable and modified as needed. In addition to this, age qualifications should be considered for future research. Not necessarily qualifications, but I believe it should be expanded up into a later developing community. Just due to the fact that the maximum age in these and almost all articles that I did come across within the ID community have focused more on children, adolescents, teens, which is great. I do think that can also be seen as a positive. However, I feel like it kind of neglects the older community. And one more thing that I did think really needed some insight was the current research in the natural environment. So as much as SIB or self-injurious behaviors really do need to be stopped, considering pica can be considered to be in that category, generalization into the community is a super important step that I feel like it's been overlooked a little bit. I do think it's great that they've been able to show these leaps and bounds into stopping or slowing down pica in a clinical setting, especially in dangerous situations. However, generalizing it and improving the quality of life of an individual in the natural setting would really be something that I feel like makes a huge difference. Integrating them into the community where they can attain the social skills, potential model from those in the community, etc. Due to this, we really should establish whether they are applicable in the community, how they can be generalized to a modern day society, and how it may be possible to develop successful behavioral interventions appropriate to the requirements of the general population and those who require the help of behavior interventions the most. Thank you for listening. Here is just a quick look at some of the reference that I did use within my analysis. Thank you.